Yeah. So, and welcome back. If you, there may have been a pause there, if you're just joining us on the videos, sometimes there's a little break in between them there. But the president did not view it as constitutional. It's important for us to recognize that today. It's just part of our history, knowing where a lot of people are coming from. All right. Describe the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was actually a bundle of 3 different compromises, but it agreed to admit Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to keep the balance between slave and free states. Okay, and then all future bondage, okay, was prohibited to in the Louisiana Purchase north of the southern border of Missouri. So basically, it established a line of demarcation of which there could be no slavery in the rest of the Missouri territory. So we kept it free. We kept it equal, but then the rest of the area we're going to see will stay. Missouri was allowed to be entered as a slave, but it's keeping the balance of power, and so it allows for peace and the continuation and development and growth of the American system and the American economy and power. What Chief Justice greatly increased the power of federalism? And that is John Marshall. John Marshall, a number of different cases. Chief Justice John Marshall. And in McCulloch versus Maryland, he declared the bank was constitutional. All right, and this gave he gave the doctrine of loose construction its most famous formula. He said that it permitted the government to act for their benefit, and this is what allowed the government to do a lot more. Okay, 2 years later, he gave another victory that said that he said that this Virginia and the individual states, they had to answer to the Supreme Court, and you could appeal to the Supreme Court, and they could overturn state Supreme Courts. And this is a very interesting case here, because it was only in a state that this was happening, but this was not in a federal thing. Okay? Another thing that was important here is the case of Fletcher versus Peck. Fletcher versus Peck, and I'll just give you a little 10-second background. Basically, a Georgia legislature, the legislative body there, was bribed to give 35 million acres to some private investors and private speculators. The next legislature, yielding to the angry public, canceled the crooked transaction. But the Chief Justice decreed that the legislative grant was a contract. And even though it had been fraudulently secured, it was a contract, and the Constitution forbids state laws impairing contracts. And this is important because it established property rights against popular pressures. And why is this important? As we speak today, in South Africa, their representative government, their parliamentary system, is voting, and they're basically voting to overturn property rights. There's a number of wealthy farmers there who have descended from the lineage of the Boers and the Dutch farmers from several hundred years ago, who own a great deal of property. The legislature, elected by the Democratic popular majority, is basically, and I don't believe I'm exaggerating here, literally taking their land away from them and redistributing it to their supporters, and they're doing so because they can make it legal by voting. Now, I know there's also a lot of violence, and there's been a lot of killings of the Boer or the farmers there, Boer, and that's the Dutch descendant farmers, and I'm not necessarily talking about that, but it's very important because it clearly establishes that it doesn't matter what the will of the people is. The will of the people is not above what the law is. And if there's a law, if there's a contract made, it doesn't matter if the next group comes along and wants to change it, wants to change what that contract was made. That contract is valid, and people have property rights above what the will of the people. All right. There's the Dartmouth case. In the Dartmouth case, the college would be granted a charter by King George, but the New Hampshire state legislature tried to change it. Okay? Well, once again, the Constitution protected contracts against state encroachments. Okay, and this is a big deal because we have the states, they can't interfere with private enterprise and private corporations. If there is a contract that has been established, a state just can't choose to vote and void, Exxon Mobil's contract with AT&T. Now, there is some rulings that we've had in the 1920s and 30s established for companies with super large sizes, etc., that they have to be approved by the Federal Trade Commission. That's a different story. That's not what we're talking about here. But he established clearly individual rights and then established the limits on the state and the government encroachment on commerce. Okay, and number 13, who invaded Florida and their actions eventually led to Florida joining the Union? And this is Andrew Jackson. Not following orders, he went into Florida. Got permission to go out into Florida after Indians, warring Indians, and wild people who were causing a lot of problems there in Georgia and Tennessee and Mississippi. And he goes into East Florida. But part of what happened then is he ignored his instructions, which were specifically not to start a war with Spain, not to interfere with Spain, and basically goes and captures all the Spanish towns. The result of this was eventually, in the Florida Purchase Treaty of 1819, Spain gave Florida to the U.S. in exchange for the U.S. Not claiming Texas, which would become Mexico, and eventually back to the United States, but and therefore establish an equal rights. But it's interesting here that Jackson was going to be punished, maybe fired, etc., disciplined, but except that one member of the by the president, except one member of his staff who was the Secretary of State, I believe, at the time, and John Quincy Adams stood by Andrew Jackson and looked and saw the advantages that this could pose for the country, even though he may not have agreed with Jackson's methods, and stood by Jackson and defended him. It's interesting because Andrew Jackson's political career could have been destroyed at that exact actual moment. However, by John Quincy Adams keeping that, saving him, he actually kept Andrew Jackson's political career alive, and later on they became the most bitter of political opponents. The Monroe Doctrine. What was the Monroe Doctrine? The Monroe Doctrine was simply a message to the rest of the world that we will not interfere with your stuff, but do not come over here and try to colonize anything that is currently in the Western Hemisphere. If it's a current colony, the United States is not going to try to conquer it. And that is very important because then those nations in Europe do not have to worry about the United States trying to conquer their colonies. But you also find that he's saying to Europe, stay away. If you go and try to conquer any colony, the United States will join that group or that colony and fight back against you. And this really kept the British from coming over. But it's interesting here. You don't find the Americans going, as an American, you don't find us going and conquering anybody. The United States is the first empire in world history that didn't just go around conquering everyone. There's two places that we freed from the Spanish. They had been conquered by the Spanish and were brutally mistreated. We freed them and then allowed them to either join us or become their own independent nations, and freed them multiple times from people. That is Puerto Rico and the Philippines. We freed them from Spain and allowed them to develop their own independence, and freed them from Japan and that war. And they're their own independent country. And today, Puerto Rico is an is an American territory, self-functioning American territory, very similar to a state. It has not been granted or chosen to get statehood. It's not gotten to that point. But it may or may not. That's a whole other discussion. Honestly, most people haven't thought much about Puerto Rico being granted statehood, but nor have they District of Columbia. It is just like this. Puerto Rico is similar to the District of Columbia in that it is American territory. But it is interesting here. You don't find the Americans going and conquering colonies from anywhere in the world. The Americans, they spread westward, they spread westward, they spread westward. They allowed Texas to join the Union. They, you know, now they did capture California in war, but it was ceded to them, and it was Californians had declared their independence, and they joined the Union. And you'll find that the Americans went into Canada and fought a little bit in the War of 1812, but there's no colonization there. Alaska was purchased, Louisiana was purchased, Gadsden was purchased. We have here the Florida Treaty, and so what you have is you may have some aggression on American parts here and there, but basically within the confines of their own borders, not out there. You didn't find the United States going out and colonizing, you know, various places in Southern American islands in the Pacific and islands in the Caribbean, which they could have. You know, it's right there close by. You know, places like Cuba or Jamaica, the Cayman Islands where I used to live, or you know, overseas. You don't see that. You don't see that happening. And so that is very important. Now, places that didn't have functioning governments, etc., like, you know, Hawaii was established, and it was not a colonization. There was no functioning. No one owned Hawaii at the time. There was not a functioning, you know, government there. They went and conquered and made it and colonized them, like we think of. So it's very interesting. So thank you for joining me, and have a great day.